Hello and welcome to this edition of Naturally Scott. I'm Scott Harris. My guest today is Lynn Scarlett. As always, we're talking about things of nature, birds, animals, parks, just a bunch of different things. Lynn has some fascinating stories to tell, and if you want to hear them, stay tuned, and you will find out about her lying in the sand in the middle of the night catching turtles, eggs from a leatherback turtle. You'll find out about her being in Midway Island and surrounded by tens, if not hundreds of thousands of albatross, or her sitting on an alligator's head. You'll also find out what it was like to be eighth in line to be president of the United States. Fascinating woman with a lot of things to share, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. So join us, listen in, and at the end of the podcast, we've got field notes coming up. And today's field notes is about National Wildlife Refuges, of which there are almost 600, and which Lynn was very much involved with when she was Deputy Secretary of the Department of the Interior. So you're going to have a blast today. You're going to love meeting Lynn and hearing her stories. So stay tuned, and here we go. Thank you. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. This is going to be a great one. I'm Scott Harris. The podcast is Naturally Scott. And for those of you that are joining for the first time, we try to focus on birds or animals or parks, whatever it is that our guest has that they want to talk about. We keep it fun, we keep it light, but we also keep it informative. There are some things to learn, which we're going to do from today's guest, who's more focused on that perhaps than some of our other guests. And so I'm excited about that. This is Lynn Scarlett. Lynn, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really very much looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for having me.
You bet. So as with some of my previous guests, Lynn is also a guest in the upcoming book, Why We Love Birds, 52 Birders on Birding. And she has some fascinating stories there. I'm going to cheat and use a couple of them in our conversation today. And our conversation today is not going to be quite as chronological as many of them are. I'm going to move it in a couple different directions, but only because I'm blessed to have some of this information before we start. So Lynn has a fantastic career and background, and we're going to talk about a bunch of that. And she's got some great birding stories with Midway Island and condors and a number of terrific things. And I'm sure there's some non-birding stories that we didn't focus on in the book in our conversation there, but maybe we can touch on today. But we have to open with something that I am still find fascinating, which there was a point in Lynn's life when she was eighth in line in the presidential succession line. She was eighth to be president of the United States. She was Deputy Secretary of the Interior under President Bush, the second President Bush. And there was a 4-month period in the middle when you were the acting.
About 3 months when I was acting secretary. Yep.
So as acting secretary of the Department of the Interior, Lynn was eighth in line to be president, which is just a remarkable thing. Anything you want to share about what that felt like? I mean, I understand you've had some great things in your career and we're going to talk about it, but that had to be a moment.
Well, to be perfectly honest, I barely even knew that was the case until somebody pointed it out to me. So, I really loved the role of deputy secretary because that role, you're chief operating officer of the whole department, which means the national parks, wildlife refuges, the Bureau of Land Management, lands, Indian Affairs. I mean, just such a vast extent of responsibilities and managing about 20% of the nation's land. So I really loved that operational dimension, as opposed to paying too much attention to the hierarchy and the titles and so forth. But I must say, when somebody pointed out to me that I was eighth in line, I thought, oh, well, that's pretty novel.
Did you put down a quick list of who the 7 were ahead of you to make sure they didn't have dinner together?
The pecking order all pertains to, some of it's set out right in the Constitution. There's the Speaker of the House, of course, the Vice President, Speaker of the House, and so forth. But then after that, it's a particular sequence of secretaries in the cabinet. I just happened to be at that point in the cabinet.
Well, I think it's a story. And I'm curious, and I didn't ask you this previously in our conversations. As Deputy Secretary of the Interior, are you part of the cabinet meetings, or was that 3-month time when you were part of the cabinet meetings?
Well, it's a little bit of both. So for the most part, the secretary attends the cabinet meetings. So that means during the 3 months when I was acting secretary, that was my role. I did attend some cabinet meetings. But there are some cabinet meetings that are a little bit broader. And if a particular cabinet has some particular role in the meeting, the deputy secretary might accompany the secretary. So I did get to go to cabinet meetings and also a lot of other meetings with the president, actually, in the Oval Office.
Well, that's fairly cool. I will share with you, just because it's a neat thing. My father was in the Navy and was very junior. He fought in the Korean War and he was decorated and, apparently had a neat career. But at one point, and I apologize, I forget the name of the admiral, he was the top aide to the top admiral of the Navy, who once a month would meet with President Eisenhower. And my dad, as his aide, would go into the Oval Office, and they would be the only three people in the Oval Office. No Secret Service, nobody else, just the head of the Navy, the President of the United States, and my father, as he said, the lowest form of grunt that there could be. His job was to get coffee and do the flip chart. They had flip charts in those days, and to do the flip chart. And he said, I would go many of those monthly meetings and never say a single word. I was not expected to speak. So just kind of a wild thing. Tell us a bit about because the Department of the Interior is so important to all of the issues that we talk about on this show. Tell us what your mission is, what you do, and then dive a bit deeper into what your responsibilities were, not so much when you were acting secretary, but when you were deputy secretary. And as you said, doing the things that intrigued you and interested you and called you to a job that I think you were first hesitant to take.
Well, so it's an absolutely fabulous department. I mean, what could be more magnificent than being in a department that manages the 570 plus National Wildlife Refuges, all the national parks, of course, it had the responsibilities for offshore oil and gas leasing, and then later, of course, the renewables program offshore, Indian affairs. I mean, so diverse. The management of Hoover Dam, Grand Coulee Dam, those big dams of the West. So really a vast portfolio. And the deputy secretary essentially serves as the chief operating officer. So you interlink with all the agencies. So with the head of the Park Service and the head of Fish and Wildlife and the head of Indian Affairs. And sometimes I said, I'm one part cattle driver, one part Solomon, and I don't know, one part chief cook and bottle washer, because really the bureaus have just literally all over the map. Throw a dart on the map, there's an interior issue going on somewhere at any given point. Really outstanding civil servants, and then the presidential leadership. And so the deputy secretary tends to really bring all those folks together where there are issues that transcend bureaus, and you need to get good coordination so everybody's marching in the same direction, so to speak, or really issues where the right pathway isn't clear and you really have to talk them through. So the deputy secretary sort of sits atop all that. And then many issues will be resolved by the deputy secretary, but then there oftentimes one then goes to the secretary and says, well, we've all met and here's this tough issue and here's what we think we ought to do. So there wasn't anything in the department that in one way or the other didn't touch the deputy secretary's office. At one point, I was even head of law enforcement, which I kind of got a kick out of. I mean, all these major offices report, through the assistant secretary and then the deputy secretary. So I found myself, for example, after 9/11, which occurred while I was there, having to work with the law enforcement office on how do we do risk assessments for the Statue of Liberty or the Washington Monument. How do we look at all those waters at those great big dams to see if they're vulnerable somehow to adverse action? So just introduction to issues that I never in my life would have contemplated.
Well, that's amazing. Now, a lot of times when we think about the different departments, right? The different cabinets, we think that they might have a position, and then that position is usually opposed by somebody, by some group of people. But I just have to imagine that with all of the different groups that were under the purview of the Department of the Interior, there must have been battles inside with, we want to do this and another group wants to do that. And then, so you're playing den mother, trying to bring everybody together and reach some common sense.
I mean, when you're managing 500 million acres, you're at the nexus of people, land, water, and wildlife. And people have different priorities, different sense of what's the right way to manage those lands? Should there be logging? Should there be snowmobiles in Yellowstone? I mean, the list goes on and on. I would not quite call it battles internally as much as I would say there would be dynamic discussions. So people would discuss, for example, whether one should ban snowmobiles in Yellowstone. And some people thought yes, and some people thought no, absolutely not. And some people thought, well, maybe can we reduce it? I mean, there were issues like that, and you had to work them through. But I mean, my approach was always one of dialogue, conversation, respect, listening, and then trying to get people to talk through and end up in some shared space before we would say, go to the secretary and say, well, this is what we think we should do.
And was the secretary generally agreeable to what you would bring after you and everybody else had put in the time? I don't mean a rubber stamp, but
Yeah.
was
well,
that given when you walked into the secretary's office, was that given a lot of weight, the time, the effort, the
Yeah.
people and all that? It was. Okay.
Well, I would say so. Now, I worked with two secretaries, first Gail Norton and then Dirk Kempthorne, who had been governor of Idaho. And I would say when the team came in, that is the deputy secretary and the assistant secretaries and the various bureau leads, go in and say, we talked about this and here are the complexities and here are the trade-offs and we think this is the way to go. Yeah, the secretary would pay a lot of attention and not necessarily always agree 100%. Sometimes even say, well, I really prefer this other option. But yeah, I mean, I like to say those the best decisions are made through teamwork. Many minds are better than one. And so part of my role is to try and bring all those minds together, get all that wisdom. And by the way, including really a lot of attention to the career people. One of the things I used to say when I first arrived at Interior was, there's 70,000 employees. Let's say they have on average 10 years experience each. So they collectively have 700,000 years of experience. And I have none. The path to success is really paying attention to those outstanding career folks who have so much knowledge, so much experience. And by the way, I would say for the most part, really what you read about in your civics books. I mean, they really want to do well and serve the country.
That's great. And, the word compromise has become a pejorative in today's, we don't need to go down that road, but it's a nasty time. And compromise is now seen as a sign of weakness. I don't think it is among true leaders, but there you go. I'm curious, were there times when you needed to present something that you were passionate about in maybe a different direction, where you had to say, okay, all these people have brought this to me and we're going to go orange, but my God, I wish I could bring blue to the table?
Yeah, I mean, let me say most of the time, I didn't view the challenge as one of compromise, but rather, can we find the shared values and find that sweet spot that people can agree to? So it might not have been your perfect solution or someone else's perfect solution, but a solution that seemed durable and that it would pass muster in the courts and so on and so forth. So mostly I didn't think in terms of compromise. But yeah, for sure, I knew going in, if my mindset was that as soon as I disagreed with something, I would leave, then I would have left on day one. I mean, they're just, but what I really, sort of the way I approached it was, if there's a really good discussion and relevant information is brought to bear, and I have an opportunity to say, I think this is the approach, and it got sort of a fair hearing. If the secretary went another direction, then I'd be okay. I didn't prevail on that one with my perspective, but I'll try again next time.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. You had to understand that in any event, one of the other things that I always kept top of mind was that this wasn't about me. It wasn't about my preferences. I mean, I don't happen to like snowmobiles at all, for example. If it was up to me, we wouldn't have those. But I knew that was not the job wasn't to implement how I want everything to be. It was, what's the law? Who are the relevant people that are affected by decisions? Who has relevant knowledge? What's the science? And then to try to come out with the decision that, as I said, could be durable and acceptable.
Well, that's fantastic. So we're gonna back up a little bit, but before we do you miss it? Do you miss being a part of that?
Well, I can tell you, I sure don't miss it now.
Yeah.
I sure am glad I'm not there at this point in time. I think uh, when I stepped down, when I turned into a pumpkin at the end of my 2 terms, 8 years, um, I was ready for that departure because you're working around the clock, 7 days a week, 16, 17, 18 hours a day. I mean, these are big jobs and you're working all the time. I can remember some holidays, Christmas Day, you get a call because we have to work through some polar bear issue or whatever. And I'm on the phone for 8 hours talking polar bears. So I didn't miss it in that sense. I was ready to move on and be able to kind of spread my wings and do some other things. But I love the department, I love its mission, and what I did wanna do was to keep carrying on advancing conservation, but through other venues.
Okay. And we're going to talk about that. So, but first, we're going to back up a little bit. And if memory serves, your mom was not a full blooded birder, but I believe you described her as a Renaissance woman.
Well, my
And
mom's a Renaissance woman, and, I mean, she knew about and loved architecture and art and music and plants and animals and including birds, and we had at our house in our kitchen, on the wall, these Audubon posters, birds of southwestern Pennsylvania, because that's where I grew up. And so, I'd sit and eat my Cheerios in the morning and look at these posters with these birds on them telling me what a rose-breasted grosbeak was or whatever. And we had bird feeders, so they'd come to the kitchen window and I could see the nuthatch or the tufted titmouse. So I grew up with a mother interested in everything, knowledgeable about a lot of things. And as soon as we could wield the binoculars, she took us to the woods behind our house and showed us the scarlet tanager or all these brightly colored birds. And so I and my 3 sisters, we're all birders of sorts.
okay. I remember you used the term when we talked before. You said, as soon as I was strong enough to pick up a pair of binoculars.
Yeah, right.
Hmm. Which is kind of cool. And you defined yourself as a lifelong learner and scholar. You described yourself that way. And when you left Pennsylvania, you went to Santa Barbara
I
and went
did.
to UCSB.
I did.
And I believe you had no birding friends at UCSB, but I think you spotted a frigate bird.
I did. Well, for one thing, when I went to Santa Barbara to go to school, by the way, sight unseen, I kind of got the map out when I was thinking of where to go to college and thought, Pittsburgh, not so good. Santa Barbara, good. As soon as I saw those brochures with palm trees and the ocean, I thought, well, that looks good. But I took,
As a guy whose career was developing those brochures, thank you very much.
yeah, I mean, but I brought my binoculars with me, and even though I didn't know anybody who birded, there are a lot of wetlands around the campus and including around the dorm where I was, and I would just go out by myself with my binoculars and look at the egrets and herons and whatever. But then, I think it was my sophomore year, I moved to the notorious little community of Isla Vista, which is where all the students move after their first year in dorms, and lived on Del Playa, which is the ocean road. And
My
our
sister lived on Del Playa when she went to UCSB.
our house had a big porch that looked right out over the cliff and down to the ocean. And one morning I look out and there, sitting right on the balcony of this porch, was a frigate bird. And, his chest all poofed up and stuff. And I'm like, wow. And the funny thing is, at the time, because I was new to Santa Barbara and we didn't have eBird or any of those tools,
Mhm.
I thought it was a really cool bird to see and I knew what it was, but I didn't know that it was really rare to see one in Santa Barbara. And I didn't know about the, Audubon hotline that in those good old days you'd call up and say, rare bird, I saw this. So I just, enjoyed it myself and remember it ever since.
And they're beautiful, aren't they?
Oh, they're spectacular birds.
They're just gorgeous birds. They're gorgeous birds. Now, you had mentioned on the conservation or the nature side, you kind of thought there were, I think you told me there are really 2 tracks. There's the romance track, which you said was birds, bees, wildlife, and nature, or there's the sludge track.
Right.
And you love public policy and political science, and you chose the sludge track.
Well,
So tell us.
I wouldn't exactly say I chose it. It's that, you have to remember that I was in college right at the sort of advent of all the modern environmental laws. So the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act.
So the early 70s?
Yeah, this, early
Yeah.
70s. All of that was unfolding. And so because I was a political scientist and policy analyst, I always was interested in environmental policy. And so a lot of the discussion was around air pollution, water pollution, all of that sort of thing. So yes, some of those of us in the policy analyst realm used to joke that there's the romance and sludge. And a lot of my work was on solid waste and air pollution. I chaired for the state of California the Automobile Smog Check Commission, looking at how effective that program was, for example. But if the truth be told, my heart was always in nature. So when I had the chance to go to the Interior Department, after a little reluctance, thinking, oh my goodness, I don't want to go to Washington. Heavens, I live in Santa Barbara. When I finally decided that, gee, the stars would never be aligned like that again, this was an opportunity. I found myself in this department that had this significant nature portfolio. And in some ways, as I started to meet all the fish and wildlife people or the park people and go on field trips, I thought, oh, these are my people. Wear big, long, tall waders up to their hips and traipse around in the wetland. And I just, I thought, oh,
You found your tribe.
and they had the same passions that I did, and I loved that.
Well, it's a great thing, isn't it, when you find that in any part of your life?
Absolutely.
But when you find a group of people that enjoy the same food or the same music or, the same activities, or in your case, the same profession, it's a great thing. It's invigorating. It's exciting. You said to me, nature is not just nice, it's essential.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, a lot of folks have thought of conservation and thought of nature really from an aesthetic standpoint, that we need these beautiful parks, we need these beautiful refuges with that sort of aesthetic lens. But what I strive to remind people of is that nature is essential for mental health. It enhances exposure and connectivity to nature. Nature enhances cognition. It's good for physical health, being out and outdoors. But beyond our human connection, wetlands, for example, purify water. Coastal marshes, they actually help to reduce storm surge, thereby protecting coastal communities. So there's just so many ways in which natural systems really keep the world going. Think about agriculture, think about pollination. All those birds and insects and so forth give us free pollination services that are essential for agriculture. So yes, nature has its spiritual dimension, its aesthetic dimension, but it's also very fundamental to our well-being.
So I'm curious, and obviously we have large tracts of land that you were responsible for, the BLM land and the forestry and whatnot, but also a large number of islands, right? The wildlife refuges and the national parks and everything, which are spectacular. And now there's a growing effort to connect some of those islands. Yellowstone to Yukon being one of the great dreams of people that are trying to make that happen. Tell me your thoughts on that. Are they realistic goals that we can do that? Close to where you live in Santa Barbara, we put the overpass up in Agora over the freeway so the animals could cross, which is a neat thing. That's a small collection. It's not exactly going from Yellowstone to the Yukon, but going from the east side to the west side of the freeway, it does improve the life and the lifestyle of the animals that live there. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, absolutely essential, that connectivity. When we first started out, like 100 years ago, say, Teddy Roosevelt and Pelican Island with the first wildlife refuge, we really thought of these sort of islands of conservation, places that might have had a lot of biodiversity, really rich in wading birds or whatever they might be, whatever the creatures might be, or some beautiful scenery, as in Grand Canyon. But as time has gone on, we've realized that Barry Commoner, the writer, once wrote, everything is connected to everything. And we realized that real natural systems health requires this interconnectivity rather than these islands. And so the good news is, over the last, say, 2 decades, maybe even 2.5 decades, there's been a growing orientation to what we call large landscape conservation. And that is, looking at big areas and seeing where we have, say, existing parks or refuges, but then looking at where there are wildlife corridors and trying to then either have conservation easements and or actually purchase lands that would connect those so that the elk can go from one place to the other. Or think about migratory birds. We initially thought of these wildlife refuges for the birds just for one point in time. But I mean, some of these birds go all the way from the Arctic all the way down to southern tip of Argentina. And so you need these stopover places along the way, and you need some kind of connectivity. So first of all, I think that lens of connectivity is essential. It really is critical if we're going to sustain wildlife and sustain meaningful natural systems. Secondly, the good news is there's more and more efforts to work in that direction. So you ask, is it working? Well, yeah. The Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, a group with which I'm linked, they have fantastic science where they've sort of looked at, well, where are protected areas, where are critical corridors for grizzlies or whatever, and then set about working with communities to protect those lands that are those links. That's one organization. There's a group called Network for Large Landscape Conservation. And it's literally hundreds of groups across the country working at that scale. How do we, and it doesn't mean putting everything into federal parks or federal refuges. It means looking at what there is and finding ways to connect through, as I said, easements or through some land purchases. And then through these wildlife crossings. The largest one in the world, you just mentioned, goes across 10 lanes of freeway right in Agora, just a little bit south of me. And by the way, it's getting close, not quite ready, but close to being done. But these are cropping up all over the place.
Well, I think we're taking some solid steps and hopefully we can move forward. I mean, what Teddy Roosevelt started and what people like you have continued over the last century are spectacular, but we need to keep moving forward. We can't rely on just parceling out the spectacular. I mean, by the way, I love Yellowstone and Yosemite and the Grand Canyon. Do not misunderstand. My Christmas present to myself every year is a trip to Yellowstone in January.
Fabulous.
So I'm a big fan of these things, but as I've dove into this in this podcast and the book that you and I are both a part of, opened my eyes to a lot of things that I wasn't aware of before. And I'm disappointed in myself that I wasn't, but I'm excited as I learn more about it. And so these things like the Yellowstone to Yukon and the wilding and the rewilding and some of these issues, they're so spectacular and so exciting. And of course, they're going to run up against, some people that object, and that's to be expected. And, that's where, to your point, you start to get together and you try to get best practices and best ideas and some kind of compromise that can work out. And so we'll see what happens. Now,
Well, I want to add one more piece to that because
please.
Our ability to advance conservation and sustain natural systems is not wholly dependent only on the public land. So increasingly, for example, there are many groups working in partnership with farmers, the agricultural sector, to alter certain practices so that those farmlands can also be good hosts for various species, for wild nesting birds, for example, or other things. So, and even in our
waiting to plow, for example.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So once they've taken their crop, traditionally they plow right away, but many farmers have been convinced there's no downside to waiting. Let the the ground nesting birds go through their cycle. And then we'll plow.
Or do stream bank fencing so your cows, for example, don't go into the stream, which has contamination, and you get shrubby overgrowth, and that cools the stream, and so the trout come back. So there's just lots of things. And even in our own backyard, I'm on the board of the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. And the Botanic Garden here has a great big native plant initiative. And it's trying to like work with transportation department to have native plants in the median strips of the highway or people in their own backyards, because all of these can contribute to helping sustain species.
We've tried to do that on our property and to great success. We set up a bird sanctuary, we built a creek, and we are just not overwhelmed. We are blessed with incredible number of birds and squirrels and chipmunks, and my wife's not as thrilled about the number of deer we attract because she feels like when she goes to Lowe's and buys all the plants, she might as well just take the deer out to dinner.
Right.
And save the time of planting. But nonetheless, that's the price you pay. I think that's just the thing that happens. And I believe we're becoming more aware. You mentioned the botanical gardens. I was in the San Antonio Botanical Gardens a couple of days ago when I was down in Texas. And you get to see a lot of the indigenous stuff. And it's native plants are beautiful. And when you see all the pollinators that are there, it's magnificent. It's really a thrill. So if we can educate people that way and bring some of that stuff back, and we've done it on a large scale before, victory gardens in World War II. We changed the way that the entire country thought about gardens. We can do it. I hope it doesn't take an immediate crisis. Many would argue we're in crisis right now, but I hope we are able to make that change. And if we make it incrementally and we just keep growing, I think that'd be fantastic. I've got a couple of things I want to touch on with you. You spent some time with the Nature Conservancy.
Yep.
Tell me what you did there. Tell us what your responsibilities were and what some of the goals and mission were.
Well, I should start by saying the Nature Conservancy is the largest conservation organization in the world and operates in some 80 countries and all 50 U.S. states. It started in the U.S., it started in New York for that matter, and has always had the mission of working with people to advance conservation and kind of with the mantra that conservation benefits people and nature. And so they've done projects small and large and really all over the world. Early on, did a lot of land conservation, that is purchase lands, make it into a preserve and or purchase it and then transfer it to the Park Service or wildlife refuge. But now it does a lot of partnering, for example, with the fishing community or with farmers or with indigenous communities in African villages on sustainable practices for grazing or whatever the need might be, or sustainable fishing practices, so the conservation is touching everything that we do. And my role was global. So I was the global chief external affairs officer. So I worked with our U.S. government relations team, our international team, the team that went to all of the climate conventions and the biodiversity conventions and so on. And then also with our state and local teams in the U.S. that worked on a lot of ballot initiatives on conservation. But then with all those countries linking up to their teams on various, efforts, whether it's in Australia or Kenya or somewhere, on advancing the tools of conservation. So I worked with a lot of partners, both within the organization and then external to the organization.
Similar to what you did when you were with Cabinet.
I mean, in many respects,
Yeah.
It's all about partnering, all about teaming up to problem solve.
All right. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Yeah.
Tell us about your time there and what they do.
Well, so I didn't work there. I was appointed during the Obama administration, first to be on the Science Advisory Board of NOAA, and then to chair the Science Advisory Board when Kathy Sullivan was the administrator of NOAA. And that Science Advisory Board met periodically and with with the leading scientists and looked at where more science needs were, looked a bit to the future, what kinds of new technologies might NOAA need to invest in order to continue to pioneer conservation tools, knowledge about fish and fisheries, knowledge about climate change, weather, I mean, all those kinds of things. And on this advisory board was a real mix of people. So many scientists, but also what I might call sort of fisheries practitioners, just people with different backgrounds who could advise NOAA on these different things.
Okay. Wildland Fire Leadership Council.
Oh, well, that
What
was
what does that council do, and what did you do with them?
so that was while I was in the Bush administration. And already way back then, wildland fire was increasingly a big challenge. We were seeing more and more catastrophic wildland fires, fire behavior that was more extreme than we had seen in the past. There are reasons for that. And the Wildland Fire Leadership Council brought together the Forest Service, the various interior agencies that had forest and fire management responsibilities, state fire agencies, tribal agencies, and even local, to think through, what were some of the key needs to ensure good cooperation and coordination? What were some of the challenging issues about which we needed more information? How could we better understand fire behavior? Thinking a lot about fuels reduction, that is going in and either doing prescribed burns and or some thinning of underbrush and so forth, so that if lightning struck, you wouldn't get such a catastrophic wildland fire. So yeah, because I was at the Department of the Interior and my role spanned all the bureaus, I was sort of a natural selection to be the chair, or at least the co-chair, with somebody from the Forest Service on that leadership council. So I
Well,
spent a
that is,
lot of hours learning about fire, let me tell you.
I would imagine, and that becomes, I think, more and more important as time goes on. I'm going to ask you to share two birding stories, your Midway Island story and your California condor story. But do you have a non-birding story regarding maybe a megafauna or something else that happened either during your time in the interior or before or after that you might want to share?
I have so many animal stories. I mean, for example, I used to tell people that sometimes I thought while I was at Interior, I was in training to be, remember Marlon Perkins of Mutual of Omaha? I was out having so many wildlife interactions, but I'll mention one non-birding one. I was on St. Croix at a wildlife refuge that's right on the beach there, where the leatherback sea turtles come on shore. They dig nests, lay their eggs. The big mama turtle then goes back to sea, and
The leatherbacks are huge, right?
huge. I mean,
These are massive turtles.
they're like 1,500 pounds, or even I think the biggest might be 2,000 pounds. They're enormous. They look like, when you see them, like a kind of a VW bug or something. I mean, they're really big. And they come on shore, dig these deep pits, and then when they feel like the pit is just right, they start laying eggs. Well, and you go out at midnight because they do this at night. And so I went with Fish and Wildlife Service. There we were, and the turtles coming on shore. And this one turtle was digging its nest too close to the shoreline, according to the Fish and Wildlife Service. They said this nest is going to be inundated before the eggs are ready to hatch. And each egg is so critical because these are threatened species that what we're going to do is we're going to dig a nest further up shore, let the turtle dig its nest so that it feels just right, wait till it starts to then release its eggs, and then we'll move those eggs up to the nest that we built so that those eggs would have a chance to survive. So they wouldn't be. So they turned to me and they said, "So, Lynn, would you like to like catch the eggs?" I said, "Well, okay, what does that entail?" This was my common refrain, by the way, almost every outing. What does that entail? And they said, "Well, you lie nose to tail with this turtle, on the sand, and you put your hands underneath the turtle. Then the eggs will come out, and you hand them off to the Fish and Wildlife Service person, who will carry them up to the other nest." So I don't know what I was thinking. First of all, I thought, I don't know. I was thinking, well, there'll be 10 eggs or something. I mean, I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I wasn't thinking at all. So I put my
Not a
hand.
lot in life, by the way, prepares you for a midnight leatherback turtle
No,
catching.
this was not something I had experience in. So, I lie there and all of a sudden the eggs start coming. Well, those baseball practice machines where people are practicing hitting and they shoot the balls out at you?
Yes.
Well, that's how the eggs are coming out, boom, boom, boom. And I'm like, catching these things, and trying to hand them off, and at I dropped a few, unfortunately, and at one point I turned and said, "Oh my goodness, I feel like Lucille Ball." Remember that
The
chocolate
the
factory?
candies.
And,
Yes.
some of the listeners won't remember Lucille Ball and the Chocolate Factory, but I said, "Oh, I feel like Lucille Ball." Anyway, that was a pretty memorable experience.
Yeah, I would think so. I think if you have a convention with all the people that have done that in their life, there's probably not a big
Not
showing.
too many. Not
I
not
don't yeah, I think that's a smaller group than, say,
there's
people that have seen
not
Bruce Springsteen in concert.
not too
That's
yeah.
that's
I got to swim with manatee. I mean, there just were I got to go dog sledding in Denali. I mean, that was an amazing experience with Mount Denali rising up all snow covered and the dogs running in this new fallen snow, all sparkling, and the ptarmigan tracks going across it. My goodness, magic.
that one really I'm excited for you, but a bit jealous. We were in Alaska in June for 3 weeks, and we had booked, a couple of times, at Kenai Fjords to take a helicopter up to a glacier and then take this sled run down, and both times we got weathered out,
Oh,
and
summer.
so we did not get to do it, which was
Well, we had
disappointing.
the perfect day. I'll tell you one more. I know you asked for one, but
You know what? Keep going. Share
there's
them.
so many. So then there was the time that I was at Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge with the U.S. Geological Survey, the
Which
scientists.
is where?
It's in Florida.
Okay.
Florida. So anyway, so there were alligators and stuff, and it was with the refuge manager and the U.S. Geological Survey, and they were going out again at midnight, and they were going to catch some alligators so that they could like take their temperatures and measure them and monitor their health. So anyway, I went on the boat. What happens is they shine like a flashlight and the eyeballs of the alligators sort of pop up. And then they get a lasso and they lasso the alligator and bring it onto the boat. And then and they wrap its mouth with duct tape. So anyway, I said, "Okay, well, what's my job?" And they said, "Well, we want you to sit on the alligator's head while we do all this so it won't thrash around, while we do all this, like take its temperature and check its
Things that
eyes."
are probably gonna irritate an alligator.
So, you know, so okay, so I sit on the alligator's head, keep it still while they do all this stuff. Doesn't take very long. And then, you then finally they're done and I get up. But the tricky thing is, of course, that they have to take the tape off the alligator's, mouth. So anyway, they're very skilled at it, but that was another one of my jobs, sitting on an alligator head.
Did you ask them what that entailed, or did it seem obvious when you're asked to sit on an alligator's head?
Well, I probably said, "What does that entail?" And they said, "You just sit right here. No problem."
Okay. Okay. Well, there you go. Now, you do have a couple of this is not a pure birding show, by the way. We have all kinds of stuff that we cover, but we do try to throw in a couple birding things, and you have a couple of fantastic stories. So let's go to those. And let's start with the one that I think was a little more emotional, which was the California condor story that you shared with me previously.
Well, they're all emotional, but yes. So the California condor was one of the most endangered birds in the US. And in the mid 80s, the population was down to like 22 or something. And this was in the mountains behind Santa Barbara and Ventura up in Ojai. And it was decided that the bird simply was not going to survive unless they tried bringing the remaining birds in to the San Diego Zoo and starting a captive breeding program where they could breed it and then try to increase that population and then begin to release the birds. And this, at the time, the mid '80s, a good friend of mine, he's now passed away, was with Audubon and he linked up with the Fish and Wildlife Service. He was brought in from Florida to California to be one of the people that scaled the cliffs and caught the condors and brought them into captivity. Now, this was highly controversial at the time and by many people. So the ranchers of the area didn't want the bird really to continue because they didn't want an endangered species in their midst, which they thought would result in restrictions on their cattle ranching and this and that. But some environmental groups didn't want this to occur because they thought captive breeding was unnatural and that the bird should just we'd ruined its habitat, poisoned the bird, and it should just die a natural death. So there were critics from many dimensions. And my good friend who engaged in the captive breeding actually got death threats. I mean, that's how tense it was. But in any event, the good news is they brought the birds in. The captive breeding program has been successful. So there's now,
And it was San Diego Zoo and LA Zoo, right? You
well, first
mentioned
it
San
was
Diego Zoo.
Well, first it was San Diego, just San
Okay.
Diego's, but it has
Okay.
spread. So now, for
Okay.
example, right in my hometown of Santa Barbara, there's a captive breeding program. So there's now numerous zoos, but in the beginning, San Diego Zoo, and it has been successful. So there's now several hundred that have been released into the wild, and some of those, a real sign of success, have actually mated and had young and laid eggs, and the eggs have hatched. So it's the program is continuing, and we now have several hundreds of these birds rather than just 2 dozen or less than 2 dozen. The emotional part to this story, all of that is wonderful, but my friend who was involved in all that, after he did the captive breeding, he went back to Florida. And then there he stayed doing other work, conservation work, until many, many years later, about 2009 or thereabouts, he and I were both going to the same conservation conference in Los Angeles. And he had not been back in all that time, back to Ojai and Ventura and where these birds had been. So we decided, and with his wife, a good friend of mine, to meet up with Fish and Wildlife Service and go up into the wild area where the birds had been released. And so at dusk, the Fish and Wildlife Service person took us to this outlook where there were these tree snags, and it was dusk, the sky was pinkening, and these 12 condors flew in, landed on the tree snags, sort of took off again, landed again. We watched them settle in for the night at the very roosts where their ancestors used to come. And I stood shoulder to shoulder with my friend who had helped get the captive breeding program underway, really see the fruits of his labor. So you could imagine this was extremely moving.
It certainly sounds like, and I'm sorry that he passed away, but I'm glad you got to share that with him. That's a great thing. And they are beautiful birds. One of the
They're
three
they're
volt.
magnificent. People, if you look at a picture, you think, oh, that kind of has a not so attractive face. But my golly, when they fly, they have a 10-foot wingspan. And if they fly overhead, you can hear the wind whistling through their wingtips. And if the conditions are right, they can glide miles with just one flap of the wings. I mean,
Yeah.
they're awesome creatures.
Well, I saw something, it was a year ago, I guess now. I was up at Pinnacles National Park up in Northern California, and there's quite a few condors up
Yeah.
there. And you remember the opening to the original Star Wars where I can't remember all the players, but the good spaceship comes on the screen and it goes from the top to the bottom, and it's massive and it's huge. And then suddenly it's followed by the bad spaceship, which is, 50 times bigger. And it's, Lucas's signature thing. Well, I was at Pinnacles and I climbed up to the top of the mountain there, and I'm watching, and it's about 10:30. So the updrafts are coming and the thermals and things are happening. And a dozen or 15 turkey vultures come up from the backside of the mountain that I'm on. And I watch them crest the mountain and then just start to do their soaring. Well, suddenly a condor joined them, and it was like a
Wow.
Cessna and then a 747, and it was so awe-inspiring to
It
me,
is. That's
to
cool.
see that. And the turkey vulture is a good-sized bird.
Yeah.
That's a bird with a 5 or 6 foot wingspan. That's a good-sized bird. But when that condor showed up, and that's what it reminded me of, and it was fantastic. Okay, I'm gonna ask you for one more story, which is your Midway Island story, which I love.
Yeah.
So if you would share that, I would really appreciate it, and I know the audience will too.
Well, one of my great privileges in the years I was at the Interior Department was to go to some unbelievable places that I likely never would have had a chance to go without being at the Interior Department. And we were in the process of considering creating what is now called the Papahanaumokuakea National Marine Monument.
Well, that rolls off the tongue.
Oh, boy, let me tell you, when I learned that that's what it was going to be named, it was named by the state of Hawaii, I thought, "Oh, boy, I know I'm gonna have to say this, I'm gonna have to practice." So I stood in front of a mirror and practiced. But anyway, this was before that designation occurred, and we were going out to learn about the island so that we could think about the designation and so on, and so we go, I think it was in May or so. So picture this, there's several islands, but the bigger one is about 2,000 acres, and some, I don't know, 75, 80% of all the Laysan albatross in the world nest on that island. So when they arrive and then they lay their eggs and then they have their chicks, just picture this, 2,000 acres, 1.5 million Laysan albatross. You're there on foot, like walking between these birds. I mean, they're like every 2 feet. And these little fluffy baby albatross, they're all fluffy and cute looking. And the adults, they do this mating ritual where they stick their head straight up in the air and then they clack their beaks together. So their beaks is sort of go clack, clack, clack. And when there are hundreds of them doing that, the whole atmosphere sort of vibrates, you know. So it was a place where I really felt like this is their place and I am the intruder. Because there are these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of albatross, these beaks clacking in the air, vibrating, and you're just wandering among them. I mean, it was really magical. And by the way, there were all these other birds too. So there were sooty terns and red-footed boobies and frigate birds and tropic birds, and I mean, all manner of other things too. But the albatross, I mean, it was like, wow.
Well, that's spectacular. I really I hope I'm able to enjoy that one day. It would be great. Lynn, it's been terrific having you, but before I let you go, I had mentioned to you I would love for you to recommend a book that you think our audience might enjoy. And as long as it's somehow nature related, it's wide open for you to pick.
Golly, well, I read all the time. It's so hard to pick. But, you know, I think on my mind, perhaps recently, is Amy Tan's book. Amy Tan, of course, we all know her writings as a fiction writer. But during COVID, she started looking out her window to her backyard and noticing birds. And out of that, she began to draw the birds and watch the bird behavior and try to attract more birds. And so she wrote a book on that. And I, of course, can't even remember what the title of it is at this point, but
Backyard Birds is in the title.
something,
You know,
something like that.
we will throw the cover up
Good.
on the screen so
And
the
it's
audience will know.
enjoyable, enjoyable book, delightful. Her drawings are wonderful. This person that we know as a fiction writer turns out to be quite the artist. And just her tales of the bird behavior, because she doesn't just look at them and say, "Oh, that wonder what that one is." She's watching them closely. And for example, when they come to her feeders, watching the pecking order. Like there are these birds that come in and those ones, and they displace those. And she describes all that in her book. So it's really a very enjoyable book.
Well, that's fantastic. We will share that with the audience, and thank you so much. Lynn, this has been such a treat for me. Thank you so much. I know how incredibly busy you are, and I do not take it for granted that you've given us this time. The email will be up on the screen as I'm saying this. If you've got any questions for me, please email me. I'm thrilled to answer them. If you have an opportunity, this is my big pitch. If you have an opportunity to subscribe or comment or like, it's much appreciated. So much of what Lynn has shared today is important, and the more people we can share it with, the better. So we really do ask for that. And you know, there's no cost, of course, for you to do that. And it's great. We will follow with the field notes as we always do. And Lynn, if you're not familiar with that, at the end of each podcast, I do about a 5 or 8 minute thing. I pick one bird or one park or something, and I just get to ramble on about it, do a little
Well,
research.
I'd like to put one more piece, which is, you know, often we know about our parks, but so many people forget about our wildlife refuges, and they're so fantastic.
Yes.
So, you know,
Yes.
go check out the National Wildlife Refuge Association. And
Okay, well, now that's going to be my field notes after this one. I will do National Wildlife Refuges, and I'm happy to do it. It's one that I wanted to do anyway, and now that
great.
Lynn's brought it up, it would be fairly rude of me not to. So we can
Great.
count on that. So you can listen to that, and that'll be fun. We'll get that up. And as I always do at the end, I want to say thank you. I want to tell everybody to stay safe, and stay curious, which I think is critical. Thanks again, Lynn, and thanks for those of you who listen. Have a great day. Welcome to Field Notes. If this is your first time here, let me just bring you up to date a little bit. I run these at the end of each podcast, although they also stand independently, usually 5 to 8 minutes. I pick a single subject, a bird, an animal, maybe a park, do a little research on them, pull up some fun facts, share them with you and maybe why I'm interested in it. And it's a standalone piece, and they're an awful lot of fun. I enjoy doing them, and I enjoy sharing them. Today's follows the podcast we did with Lynn Scarlett. I hope that you had a chance to watch that, and if not, maybe you can go back and take a peek. But Lynn was Deputy Secretary of the Interior back under the Bush administration, and she is passionate about our National Wildlife Refuges. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, kind of to honor Lynn and her work that she did. And because they're a blast, they're fun. And I've been to a bunch of them. And I hope you have. And if not, maybe you could soon. And you'll find yourself intrigued by that after today. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services run the National Wildlife Refuge system. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services are under the protection and guidance and authority of the Department of the Interior. So that is kind of how the hierarchy goes. I will read you. I want to get this direct, so I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it directly here. This is their mission statement. The official mission of the National Wildlife Refuge is to administer a national network of lands and waters for the conservation, management, and where appropriate, restoration of the fish, wildlife, and plant resources and their habitats within the United States for the benefit of present and future generations of America. United States also includes United States territories, just to be clear. And I think that's important. There are almost 600 total National Wildlife Refuges scattered around the United States. All 50 states and every territory has at least one. They in total have 95 million acres of land and water, which is a huge tract of land or collection of tracts of lands to take care of. There are protected ecosystems, at-risk ecosystems, prairies, wetlands, deserts, coastal marshes. All of these are included. The National Wildlife Refuges provide critical stopovers for migratory birds. That is a huge problem for migratory birds as they're going to or from the United States or through the United States, as some migratory birds do, and they don't actually stay here for any lengthy period of time. There are fewer and fewer places where they can stop, be safe, refuel, and get a little rest before they continue their migration. The nearly 600 refuges include 700 species of birds, 220 species of mammals, 250 reptile species, reptile and amphibian species, and more than 1,000 species of fish. They were established, National Wildlife Refuges, in 1903 by President Teddy Roosevelt. Again, one of our great conservation presidents. Some of the things that he did are open to debate and discussion. The number of animals that he killed, even though he's a huge fan of natural history museums and of conservation in general. But nonetheless, we have to give the man credit for starting this. The very first one he did was established in 1903, and this was to protect pelicans from overhunting and from the plume trade. And this was the Pelican National Wildlife Refuge. So that's pretty cool. Teddy Roosevelt established 51 refuges during his presidency, which was a great start to kick off this program. We've added more than 500 since that first one, which was Pelican Island in Florida. And but nonetheless, something has to get these things started. And in this case, it was Teddy Roosevelt. The largest of all of them is the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which has 19.6 million acres in Alaska. To give you an idea, that's more than 20% of the total of the 95 million acres. It is a massive. It's larger than a number of states, 19 million acres. It is a huge amount of land that needs to be governed. The smallest of all, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but I'm trying, is Millie, M-I-L-L, Lacs, L-A-C-S, National Wildlife Refuge. It's in Minnesota. It's two tiny little islands. Combined, they are less than an acre. And I think about that in relative terms. I'm looking outside my office right now, and into the backyard. And our property is just under an acre and a half, which means the property we live on, this little tiny piece of property, is actually larger than one of our national wildlife refuges. That's pretty amazing. Most wildlife refuges are open to the public. Some of them around the year, some of them are a little more guarded than that. But they have 65 million visitors a year. Some are just there to see. Some of them are there to fish. Some of them are there to bird. Some of them are there to hunt. Some of them just want to see the beauty in the animals and the reptiles and amphibians and insects and birds and mammals and whatnot that are available to us. But nonetheless, this magical system of 600 different places around the country, of 95 million acres, of hundreds of species of birds and mammals and reptiles and amphibians and fish are all available to us at little or no cost. Of course, taxes are involved, but it is an amazing system and one that I hope that we can keep going for a long time because they're important to all of us. And it's a great collection. It was a great idea initially, and it remains a great idea today. And as always, when you're out visiting and seeing things, which I hope you get to do very often, stay safe and stay curious. Thanks for joining me today. Thanks to the Department of the Interior for maintaining and running these things in U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Thanks to Teddy Roosevelt for starting them. And thanks to Lynn Scarlett for reminding me of how important these are. Have a terrific day.